had such a society in which equal rights and equal benefits among citizens have been so dominant. Never have we had such a society in which medical advancement, in which society in general has progressed to a level in which we can care for one another, no matter what a race or a background or a ethnicity. That century, ladies and gentlemen, is the 20th century. Now, the resolution today stands, this House believes that the 20th century is a century of progress for humanity. My partner and I stand firmly resolved this resolution must and most certainly will stand. Now, in order to really crystallize the debate today, we need to, in fact, present you this model of how we're defining it. Well, first, we say the 20th century, self-explanatory, the 1900s to 1999, and essentially, we're going to be proving to you today that essentially the steps that we've taken forward have outweighed and negated the steps that we've taken backward, and that's really what's led to our progress through society as a whole. Now, we think that in order to determine the way today, the resolution needs to prove to us that such significant and important backward steps were taken that they outnumber the most successful steps that humanity has taken towards prosperity, ladies and gentlemen. So in order to, again, determine our burden, we have three main points that we're going to be presenting to you today. Now, first of all, the first point that we're going to be presenting is the idea of political achievement, ladies and gentlemen. Political achievement within human rights and within, just achieving democracy as a whole. Now, and also I'm going to be talking to you about scientific advancement in terms of preserving life itself, as well as preserving the quality of life. So thank you. My partner Jim also going to be talking to you about the economic and the international progress that we've made, as a global community. So essentially, this brings us first point, this idea of human rights, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. We see that essentially what we've seen today, and now more than ever before, is the idea of just equal treatment under the law, ladies and gentlemen, in most widespread parts of the world. And thank you. We see that, essentially what we're seeing now is, that before the 20th century, we saw, a society that wasn't able to organize itself in a way that we can be able to implement democracy, in most parts of the world, and did everybody say, ladies and gentlemen. We saw, a country that wasn't able to, just ignore the quality of the color of people's skin, ignore what they wore, ignore the way they dressed, ignore what gender they were, and just treat all citizens equally under the law, ladies and gentlemen. We saw, even nations that did have democracy, we saw them, they weren't able to, treat the voting citizen equally, and essentially they weren't able to, get rid of and eradicate the corruption that surrounded the democracy at the time, ladies and gentlemen. We think that we've taken huge steps in that measure. And that's why that's one of the reasons why the progress that we've made, although there are countries that still don't adopt democracy, because the progress that we've made as a whole in that respect far outweigh the countries that still don't have democracy in the world right now. And the second idea that we bring up is the idea of human rights. We see that power and power structure within men and women has changed. To 50% of the population, we see that women have become more politically engaged in the 20th century. We see that they challenge the negative connotations surrounding what takes a woman, what they can do in school, what they can do in terms of jobs, what different positions they can pursue just in their lives because of the things that used to hold them back in the first place because they were women.
How politically engaged are the women in, say, Saudi Arabia?
Okay. First of all, we thought that the opposition might bring up this case, that there are many women that still aren't of the same quality as men. But we see that the issue here, ladies and gentlemen, is that nowadays it's an issue at all. We see that in the past it wasn't an issue that women didn't have rights. In the past, there wasn't a negative connotation surrounding the fact that women weren't equal to men. It was just something that was accepted. It was just something that was like, men and women aren't equal. But now we see that it's a problem. Now we see that it's generally an issue, and we're taking steps every single day to come towards this holistic idea of men and women being equal. Thank you for that slide. Now the next idea that we bring up is the idea of just racial minorities in the first place. We think that now we've come to this agreement that you shouldn't be determined by the color of your skin. You shouldn't be determined by what you wear or what you choose to do, what religious denomination you should have. We come up with this idea that like in terms of for example, South Africa, we come up to this realization in the past that we should boycott South America, no matter what kind of trading issues we had with them, no matter how many international relations were broken, we thought that it was essential to cut ties with South America because they were segregating their African American population. And when we did it, we've completely gotten rid, not completely, but we've made huge steps in terms of getting rid of these political people who were against certain religions. If you look at even children's authors in the past, we had Rudyard Kipling who wrote racist poems about how the white man's burden to eradicate the African American person or people of certain racial minorities. You see that now if an author were to do the same thing, you see that they wouldn't be an author for very much longer, ladies and gentlemen. That's one of the huge steps that we've accomplished in general. Because we've taken away this like these negative connotations surrounding both minorities in general. And we see another issue that we address sufficiently, the idea of gay rights, ladies and gentlemen, same-sex marriage. We did it in the 21st, like before the 20th century, we used to like kill people if they were gay, ladies and gentlemen. We saw that the mainstream media just surrounded the idea of same-sex marriage and same-sex couples with a taboo. We think that now we are openly discussing these ideas, and there's no longer a taboo surrounding them. That's we think the main progress is the idea of being able to discuss these things in the first place. And that we think is very, very valuable, and that is what has been sufficiently discussed within the 20th century, ladies and gentlemen. So on to the second idea, the idea of scientific advancement in general. I think there's two ways we need to address this. Firstly, through the idea of preserving life, and secondly, through the idea of promoting quality of life, ladies and gentlemen. In terms of preserving life, we see that now more than ever before we've made advances in terms of taking down infant mortality rates. We've made vaccines now that essentially have eradicated, for example, polio in the majority of the world. We've seen many medical advances, so thank you, in terms of just vaccines, malnutrition. We've started to find ways to eradicate malnutrition in certain developing countries, ladies and gentlemen. We've been finding more and more ways just because we've acknowledged that it's a problem and we're taking steps in order to fix it, ladies and gentlemen. And that's what we think is again the main issue, coming back to this idea that we've made more steps forward as opposed to in the back. So we think that the opposition can bring out many different examples of how there are certain problems within the world currently in regards to the aspects that I've just told you. But we think again that the majority of the benefits we've told you shows us that humanity has risen up to the occasion of taking a stand against the issues that we've been faced with, ladies and gentlemen. Now, in terms of promoting the quality of life, we think that again we've been exposed to the diversity of ideas, ladies and gentlemen. We think that now more than ever, especially through the widespread nature of the internet, we're sharing ideas through every share, every tweet, every click. We're learning new things. We're expanding in general as a population. That we're learning more things, and that's why essentially we've come to this understanding through humanity as a whole. We're putting ideas up on the internet. We're being inspired by those ideas, ladies and gentlemen. We're putting those ideas back up on the internet for other people to be inspired. Because essentially, this has very much contributed to the idea of civil society in general. Because in order for us to have a civil society, we need to have a society that is very, learned in the idea of what's going on around them. Because the internet and just communications in general and the widespread communications that have been developed in the 20th century have actually aided us and helped us towards this common goal. So essentially, what have we proven to you so far on the proposition? We've shown you, we've taken steps to prove to you that the steps we've taken forward throughout the 20th century have outweighed and negated the backward steps that we've taken so far. And we've talked to you about political achievement in terms of human rights and democracy. I've also spoken to you about scientific progression in terms of preserving life itself and preserving the quality of rights. And I'm also going to be talking to you about the economic and international progress we've made so far. So because we've clearly proven to you that the 20th century was an advancement, we proudly beg to confess. Thank you.
Is there a problem with the timekeeping?
Yeah.
Let's stop for 30 seconds so these will go.
Right. When it starts again, it'll be okay, won't it?
What?
When it starts again, it'll be okay.
Hopefully, it should be.
Okay. I'm so sorry.
Right? Yeah, I know. It's a bit deceptive for us and for speakers, yeah. Wait a minute. Right, it's now my pleasure to invite the negative change presenter first.
What we just heard was a side who understandably cannot make it outside of Canada, cannot concern the concerns of the world as a whole, cannot concern the concerns of a developing world that hasn't made all these advancements, that hasn't been unified, that hasn't been able to make the same progress. And it is on that basis that we get to. First, what I'd like to get into in my speech before my 2 points is the criteria and the burdens that they set at the beginning of the round. They told us that any progress is steps taken forward and that our burden is to prove to you that we have taken steps backward. We agree with both of these things. The fact that steps were taken forward doesn't mean that in the process we did not accept the repercussions of these actions. We think that a more adequate definition and a less vague definition of what progress is that progress is learning from mistakes and moving past mistakes. And progress is ensuring that the steps that you take don't limit further development, don't limit further progress, and don't limit what we can do in the future. Furthermore, we don't think that we have to prove to you that we move backward. We think that we either have to prove to you that we remain stagnant, that the burdens and that the benefits this side proposition has proved to you are outweighed by all the harms that we're going to show you, or that we have in fact moved backwards in some areas. So let's get into the ideas that we heard in my first speech. She made this assertion that equality has been furthered a lot, that everywhere there is equality, that nobody is unequal to another person. I asked in a POI about women in Saudi Arabia, are they equal? She said no, but we accept the fact that women have to be equal. This is a very Western view. We don't think that people in Saudi Arabia accept that women have to be equal. We don't think that in every area of the world, people accept that everyone is equal. This is a very Western view. They fail to show you how their arguments hold weight outside of the West. They had this point about minorities and about how minorities are no longer being oppressed. We've seen extremely recently that there is still the Greek neo-Nazi party that is opposing minorities, that is doing things that are bad, that is doing things that side proposition would tell you no longer exist. They fail to engage with relevant examples. They fail to engage with things that have actually happened recently. Next, they brought this idea of medical advancements and about how medicine has advanced a lot. And they talked about how people now have the access to things like vaccines. We have two issues with this. Number one, vaccines and medicine is so expensive that everyone in the world does not have access. It's so expensive that people in the developing world don't have access. Number two, people in the developing world were used to develop these vaccines. People in the developing world were tested with these vaccines when they weren't educated on the harms. We took advantage of these people to take these advancements. That is a step backwards. That is not a step forward. We are not making progress. Sure.
In terms of the developing world, don't you agree that in the 20th century we've made significant steps to abandon the damaging system of colonialism that has dominated Africa and South America?
That's going to get into my point about how the ideas of colonialism still exist. The ideas behind it still exist. The ideas that we, in fact, because we are so powerful, because we are countries and we have power, we have the ability to take advantage of other nations still exist. That exists. I'm going to prove that to you later. Then they talked about how we learn more things. They think that this is in favor of losing a lot of things. We lose languages, we lose culture, we lose things all the time in favor for learning new things. We don't think that they acknowledge that outside proposition. Next, we heard this idea about the internet, about things like Twitter. We can share one thing with a click. That wasn't made, like Twitter didn't exist in the 20th century. This is the 21st century. These are internet developments that we made in the 21st century. That's just blatantly false. So now on to my first point. That is societal development. Then I'll be getting into things about international relations. And my partner Oliver is going to talk to you about resource allocation. In the point about societal development, we have two subpoints for each. The first being unequal global development, the second being human rights. Unequal global development. We see that a lot of the most developed countries develop off of the back of others. For example, in resources, the United Kingdom went into Nigeria, took their oil, took advantage of them, took the major resource that they had, and left. They left Nigeria without any oil, without any infrastructure to support themselves anymore, and they left Nigeria without any means of providing themselves with sustainability. We learned through colonization that taking resources from other countries is morally wrong. Maybe not the government does that the same way anymore, but corporations do all the time. The fact that we still go into countries, we still take advantage of them, proves that we did not learn from our mistakes, that we are still taking the same mistakes, we are still taking the same measures to make those mistakes, therefore we are not making progress. Into the second subpoint, that is the key. The ideas and practices behind prejudice still exist. In countries in the Middle East and Asia, equality hasn't been furthered at all. We see that women still aren't allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia. We see that women are still forced to wear things that they might not necessarily want to wear because women are seen as something that is less than a man. That proposition has failed to show you why in these countries they are inclined to change simply because the West thinks that women are equal. They have failed to show you this, maybe they can now.
Women have actually had the chance to discuss why they should have equal rights in the first place because of women's suffrage movement in the 1920s.
we don't think that this is true. We think that in the United States, maybe they were. In the United States, maybe the suffrage movement was a good thing. Maybe the suffrage movement was effective. Number one, this isn't the entire world. Number two, the ideas can still exist in the West. They haven't proven to you why these ideas are gone. Into the second point. Out of international relations, we have three subpoints. First, conflict. Second, diplomacy. Third, long-term disputes. Into conflict. Both world wars that we had were within the same century. We're not learning from mistakes. World War I was a completely different war than any other war we had experienced. We were experimenting with different types of killing people. We were experimenting with the most effective way to kill the most amount of people. You use technology to find the most effective way of killing people. We saw the horrors once in World War I. We saw the effects of this. We went again, we did it in World War II. World War II still happened, even though we saw the effects of World War I. We saw what happened. We did not learn from our mistakes. We think this is very clear. Diplomacy. After the First World War, the League of Nations was set up to mitigate conflict. It failed, disbanded, and there was another world war. We see that the problems that existed to start the League of Nations still exist. And the problems that existed in the League of Nations still exist with the United Nations. We created the United Nations, even though we found out that leaks like this aren't going to help. We see that people see the United Nations as failing. The United Nations doesn't have as great of a perception as we would have hoped. We see that they're facing the same problems, such as big countries not cooperating, such as big countries doing what they want. For example, the United States not taking into account what the United Nations wanted them to do. There's no cooperation or sacrifice for the good of all of society. They're thinking in self-interest. This was another one of the reasons why the League of Nations disbanded. We think it's the same with the United Nations. We're making the same mistake again. Third, long-term disputes. We haven't learned tolerance. We haven't learned things, especially such as religious tolerance. Religions still condemn each other, even though we saw no constructive outcome of this. The Israel-Palestine dispute is still happening, even though we recognize that this isn't constructive. There's nothing constructive about acting like you're superior simply because you believe in a religion. Because there are the same disputes, and people still justify their disputes in the same way, this fundamentally means that no progress has been made, because people aren't realizing that the fact that they're having these disputes for the same reasons, in the same places, simply because they want to, simply because they haven't listened to the past mistakes, they haven't listened to things that have happened in the past, they're going to make the same in the future. History repeats itself, and it is on that basis that we beg to
Now my pleasure to invite the second speaker.
Ladies and gentlemen, is humanity better protected by the establishment of international bodies better equipped to deal with resolving conflicts before they happen? Is humanity better off when the destructive and damaging properties of colonialism have been fundamentally abandoned, and now countries in former destitute regions such as Africa and South America finally have a chance to develop? We fundamentally would like to see side opposition take a very clear stance against the fact that we're not only talking about the Western world, we're also going to be talking about the developing world, and we, on that basis, we would still like to propose. So basically, let's go through what side opposition said to our points, and let's refute their points, and I'm going to be bringing forth a last constructive argument, which is this idea of the economic progress coupled with international progress and kind of back to the development world. Okay, so they basically raised in the POI that Saudi Arabian women still don't have any right, that they don't have the right to drive. Ladies and gentlemen, we ask you, compare Saudi Arabian women's rights today with how they were like in 1920. We think there's a large disparity between women's rights. Furthermore, we think there's a very fact that we're actually, thank you, having a discussion about women's rights is caused by the idea of women's suffrage. You're no irresponsible, thank you. When I raise this in the POI, we think they need to adequately address this. We essentially take on side off the proposition that in the countries where women's suffrage has been achieved, that's essentially a good thing. And in the countries where it hasn't been achieved, that we've actually even started the discussion. We think that's progress. No, thank you. Even though it would maybe is not to the extent that our opposition would like to see it, it is still better than what it was before. Okay, so they basically said that they basically attacked my party's first argument by saying like women suffered, and I think I already fully addressed that, and that we were basically like there was a Greek neo-Nazi party which still was like oppressing minorities. Ladies and gentlemen, we think that the very fact that we're discussing what such a party that has even like any place in government in its first place is the fact that we've grown away from this idea of no, thank you, that because you're born of a certain race, you're essentially less superior than another race. We think that actually, because like in thank you. In countries like the United States, for example, where African Americans have been gaining equal rights, this essentially has been translated to other rights. Like in other countries, we essentially think that society has finally come to the realization that race is an immutable characteristic. You can't change it, and it doesn't imply inferiority or superiority. We would like that opposition to address why this is essentially not a step forward program. No thank you. And essentially, they attack our second argument by saying that basically like, vaccines are still too expensive and we made them off the backs of the developing world. Like we essentially came in and like tested on like these developing world. So firstly, this is a falsification. Like evidence of this side. We think that actually vaccines were more tested on animals than they were on any like singular person in the developing world. Second of all, they think that they said they were too expensive. However, they neglected the fact that we actually already established charities to distribute these vaccines in the first place. Furthermore, we think that these vaccines weren't invented in the first place. We would have a vaccine for people in a certain part of the world, let alone for another part of the world. They essentially also thought that we lost livelihoods when we had this whole proliferation of ideas. Furthermore, we actually think that like, the internet has led to the establishment and protection of indigenous language. Because now we have the ability to create databases. Furthermore, they said that we only addressed the point of internet and how this wasn't dominant major part of the 1900s. We actually think that we can also look to the example of telephone communications, of radio communications. We would like them to address how basically I can pick up a phone and call someone on the other side of the world that is more effective than in the 1800s where it had to be 3 months for a courier to walk through the entire continent of Asia. Okay, so let's look at the construction material. Well, they basically said that they're basically first come to societal development, how we develop on the backs of others, how people still go into other countries to exploit their resources. Furthermore, what we'd actually say is in the 1900s, we had the establishment of fair trade agreements. We had the establishment of trade organizations that were meant to protect the rights of these developing world in the first place. And actually, we think that this is actually less detrimental than the already previous system we had, which was colonialism, which I'll be addressing in my constructive. They then brought us the idea that we haven't actually extended this to the Middle East and Asia. We'd actually like to bring you an example of Malaysia, a country in the eastern part of the hemisphere, which actually was one of the countries in the 20th century that was extended rights to religious and ethnic minorities. This is an example of where human rights developments in the West translated to human rights developments in the right. Their second idea was international relations. They essentially said that because we had World War I and World War II, this was an inherently bad thing. Ladies and gentlemen, we think that the very fact that after World War II, we learned from our mistakes in the past and we created the United Nations. That's the kind of progress they justified with sorcery. So thank you. And if we learned from that mistake and we created the United Nations, it's progress for humanity. Okay, so basically I'm taking construction material right now, which is I'm going to be addressing how progress is taking place in the 20th century from an economic perspective and an international relations perspective. Okay, so let's look at this economic perspective. These essentially think that we've improved the way we trade aviation in the 20th century. No longer do we have these trading ships that took 20 months or so to reach another nation without any navigation equipment available. These very quick trading routes, we have essentially basically expedited the process of trading to a very low efficiency, and essentially to basically spread well as a whole. We've removed economic barriers that separated us from the past. So now countries like in the Western Hemisphere can more adequately trade with countries in the Eastern Hemisphere due to technological advances. Okay, we've spread prosperity as a whole, and when we've seen inequality in nations, we've addressed it on a wider basis. We looked at the example of how in the 1940s, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was very revolutionary with the economic bill of rights. We think we've inherited it, but now it also shows that humanity has essentially realized that the most extreme society also deserves help. We think that is progress for humanity going.
How much does the Eastern world really benefit from having the resources taken from them from the Western world and having cheap
We would like them to explain how the Eastern world today has been so detrimented by the advancements of the 20th century. We would look at China, we would look to India, or we would look to lower countries such as Brazil and Argentina, who have all actually managed in the 1900s to actually have the actual stewardship of their resources. We would like to ask them, if they're so affluent and so wealthy today, why would we say that they were detrimented in the 20th century? We really don't understand this point. We would actually look at the example more on a socioeconomic perspective, like how in the 20th century, in the majority nations, we moved away from an aristocratic system of like social development into a system where kind of growing middle class, not only in Western nations like the USA and the UK, but also in nations like India and Brazil. We like to explain, we like science fiction to explain to us like why economic equality, the way that it happened, is such a bad thing. So let's look at the international perspective now. We essentially think that after like, we learned from our mistakes in World War I and World War II by essentially establishing the United Nations. Now what is the benefit of the United Nations, ladies and gentlemen? Well, it gives like these countries, and especially like countries that are smaller, to like have a voice, they have their own interests, like developed on an international basis. You actually think like when people, like countries that meet with each other, is that actually good for society, because no longer do we have this like idea of where when I had to interact with another nation, I would have to send a ship with a representative and he would appear in Queen Victoria's court. Now we have the United Nations, where we can all engage in meetings, where we can all engage in a debate, and we're all incentivized to make compromises in the interest of every individual nation. We think that actually we can have less conflict after the establishment of the United Nations, and we think that if we agree that our burden was actually to prove progress in the terms of learning from mistakes, if we learn from the mistakes of living in an insular fashion where countries didn't actually interact with each other at all, and we've established the United Nations, that's progress for humanity. On to my last idea, which is this idea of colonialism, which basically like countries such as Senegal, Mozambique, and like Argentina, or essentially free from colonialism, helps us get to the developing world. Previously, there was a massive inequality in these nations. There was a massive loss of these countries' essential sovereign right to determine their own future. We think this has been on a political basis, and this is good on like on another basis, because like, these countries had like, the opportunity to develop their own resources, and we think this has benefited the developing world as a whole. So what did I prove to you today? I've proved to you, I basically take down the whole context of development in international relations. I proved to you how we're debating not only the West, but the East too. I proved to you that if we learn from our mistakes and we establish international bodies to deal with what we have in the past, and for these reasons, side proposition firmly remains an information of the resolution today.
It's now my pleasure to invite the second executive speaker to present the documentation.
Side proposition started this debate by giving us this wonderfully complex model about steps. And are we going up the steps, or are we going down the steps, or can we continue to go up the steps in the future? But what we told you in response to this is perhaps we should quantify this a bit more. We put some criteria into place where we told you that we should be able to learn from our mistakes, that we should be able to have sustainable development. And we haven't heard side proposition really deal with any constructive matter or do any refutation of the ideas that we brought up on this sort of basis. And that's why we believe that we're clearly winning this debate so far. So let's go into some defense of the arguments that were brought up by our first speaker, Roy. First of all, we talked about societal development. We told you that there's individual development. We told you that human rights is an issue. They talked to you about trade organizations. They told you that that the system that's put in place now is one that is much better than the colonial systems that we had in the past. We say that the difference between colonialism and what occurs now in the Eastern world is actually very superficial. Now, instead of governments going into countries and taking control, we have this sort of farce that there's actually a government in place, when really all that's happening is these resources are just being sold very cheaply to companies. Instead of governments doing this action, we instead just have large multinational corporations doing it. We still don't think that there's management of these resources in the Eastern world that means that these countries and the people that live within them are truly benefiting from any sort of development, from any sort of trade. And that's the issue that we continue to see. We continue to see that these countries have not learned from the mistakes that they've made in the past, or they simply are not in enough control to do so. So we haven't seen this point fall. Now, into the idea of international relations, where we told you about conflict, where we told you about diplomacy, when we told you about long-term disputes. Really, they didn't tell us why conflict got any better in the 20th century. So let's deal with diplomacy and let's deal with long-term disputes. As a response to diplomacy, they told you both in rebuttal and constructive matter that the United Nations is this great international body that makes it much quicker to deal with all these large issues, with this conflict. We tell them that they should tell us the difference between the League of Nations and the United Nations, because we didn't get that differentiation, how we learn from our mistakes in creating this new body. Because ultimately, it's impossible to make the justification that the United Nations is preventing any sort of conflict when we have such a broken system. They told us that there's less conflict that's taken forth since the creation of the United Nations. We say that's simply not true, that there hasn't been genocide that's been prevented, that we've had the Cold War, that we've had 2 Gulf Wars, a bunch of conflict in the Middle East. We haven't seen the United Nations take constructive steps in these areas, but don't you agree?
One of the benefits of the United Nations is now we're able to send peacekeepers into meetings which we're still striking conflict, but they need international community attention.
We don't think that this is something that will have occurred just because the United Nations exists. We think that these are steps that individual countries have taken on their own. We don't think that this is something that's exclusive to the United Nations or benefit exclusive steps. So the idea of long-term dispute, we gave you this interesting arguments in which we said, firstly, that the same sort of disputes are happening, or even the same exact disputes are happening that really troubled us through the 20th century. The biggest example we brought to you was the idea of Israel and Palestine. Now, this is still a conflict that's existed right in the 20th century, exists today. And then we told you that the same justification for these kinds of conflicts exists. We haven't had any refutation on this basis. We still think these long-term disputes take place. We still think that there is a lot of injustice involved in this. No thanks. Okay, now on to some refutation, what we heard from side proposition. Firstly, they told you about political achievement. They told you about how we have all these new forms of equality, how we have like more religious tolerance. They told us as a response to, we talked to you about Saudi Arabia, they told you that we're having discussion, that we have suffrage in a lot of areas with human rights. We don't have suffrage in Saudi Arabia. This discussion is not taking place, contrary from what we heard from side proposition, that we're in the same situation in that country that we have been 50 years ago, that this is not a universal movement as we're trying to be told by side proposition. Then they told us, oh, well, the fact that we're disgusted by the fact that the Greek neo-Nazis are a growing party in that country, we'd say that that doesn't prove anything, because we'd say that there was a significant amount of the population that was disgusted in the 1940s when the same sort of advocation of violence against minority groups was being brought up. We don't think that there's really anything different here. It's a growing party. There is some opposition. There is some proposition. Now, onto the idea of scientific advancement. They told you, when we told you that there's in fact testing that's being done on people of third world countries, they simply told you, no, we made that up. We didn't make that up. We have countries like Pfizer that continue to go to third world countries to in fact go through these studies on these people because they know it's easier, because they know it's cheap, and they haven't necessarily tested this on animals as being suggested by proposition. You simply cannot contest the facts. Then they told you, well, the internet actually helps us with culture. It stores languages so that they can be remaining for posterity. We say that the internet gives us one global culture. We haven't heard a justification for why that's good from side proposition. We think that that's something that's quite damaging. Then, they told you about economic progress. They told you about how transportation is good. We tell you that we think that these third world countries would be able to prosper more without these sort of trade agreements because we think they'd be able to manage their own resources, whether that's natural resources. Maybe in the case of China, that means that they're better able to use their large population to their advantage. We don't think that working for minimum wage is doing that. Then, they told us again about the UN. I feel like I've already dealt with this. I really need to get into some constructive matters. So now, onto the issue of resource allocation. We think this breaks down 2 ways. First of all, into war. Second of all, into the environment. So first of all, the idea of war. We think, as was brought up by my first partner, basically we took considerable time, effort, manpower into refining the ways in which we wage war. And of course, a lot of this took place in the actual waging of war. We'd say that the result of the main wars of the 20th century were basically nil. In the first 2 world wars, we really just got the redefinition of European borders. This wasn't really something that was worth all the effort that we put into it. We stopped this, this horrible movement that was the Nazi Party, but really there was no net gain there. There was only just net nothing. The Cold War was 50 years of building up nuclear power, or, well, not nuclear power, but nuclear arms, ultimately, that's just the destruction of the world. We have two problems with the way that resources were allocated in the war. First of all, we say opportunity costs. So USSR, throughout the Cold War, didn't spend as much money as they needed to on domestic issues. That's why they collapsed in the 90s. That's why their people suffered throughout all this period. We don't think that that's a net benefit to have created weapons at the expense of this. Then we'd say the destructive potential of what we've created in terms of war. We already saw it in Hiroshima, but we think now we have the ability to destroy any major world city and send it back 30, 40, 50 years. We can't say that that's a positive development. We think that could have dire repercussions in the future. So now on to the idea of the environment. We think industrialization to a large extent occurred in the 20th century, and industrialization, what was initially done, was done with a short-term mindset. When we create a factory, that means that we can mass produce, that means we get a return in profit. This isn't something that happened responsibly. It happened with a great toll to the environment. We released CFCs, we destroyed the ozone layer, there's large ice caps melting. So that's one of the two problems, that there's a lot of environmental costs that have already occurred. But we say that these systems are now already in place. We have a dependency on energy, on factories, on manufacturing, that in fact means that we haven't had economic progress long term by this great industrialization, because to continue the safety of our people, this means that we have to wean off our independence on the systems we've created, and we have to reconstruct. That's not something that's beneficial, that's not progress that we've made in this century. Thanks.
Right, it's now my pleasure to invite the third speaker.
Ladies and gentlemen, so far, all of what we've heard from side opposition is because the world isn't perfect today, that means that essentially no progress has happened. We on side proposition take exception to this interpretation of the motion, and going through the three main areas of clash today, I'll prove to you why the 20th century has unequivocally been a century of progress for humanity throughout all parts of the world. Okay, so now moving on into firstly this idea of human rights. And basically, Dana brought up this idea of human rights and how minorities, such as women, such as gays, such as racial minorities, all essentially prospered during this era. Now, this idea has basically been dropped by side opposition, and the only real response to this was that, essentially women in Saudi Arabia are oppressed, therefore that negates everything that women have achieved in all other parts of the world. But ladies and gentlemen, the fact that women are essentially the majority of the debaters here today, the fact that there are more women right now, the fact that the women are poised to truly, fix the economic and political and social damage that has been done to them throughout essentially the entire period of civilization, and this is poised to happen in my lifetime, this is undoubtedly a manifestation of progress. And we think that the fact that, maybe some women in Saudi Arabia don't have equal rights, well, Jamal effectively already refuted this by telling us that, there's a discussion about it. This is something we're disgusted by, and this is also something they are disgusted by, ladies and gentlemen. We saw last year the protest of women in Saudi Arabia essentially advocating by feminism, by rejecting this idea that somehow because they're women they can't drive. And they took control of vehicles, and they did drive. And influential women within Saudi Arabia were a part of this. A Saudi Arabian princess actually gave up her seat in support of this, in support of the drive for women's rights. So we don't buy that, the women's suffrage movement in the West has had essentially no effect on other places in the world. We see places like India, where there's a massive amount of members of parliament who are actually women. We see female presidents from all around the world. We see Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner of Argentina. We see Dilma Rousseff of Brazil. We see Indira Gandhi of India. We see all these examples of women leaders. So we reject this idea that essentially everything we say is irrelevant.
out of it because the world is perfect. Okay, and then they brought up this idea of this one Greek neo-Nazi party, which essentially, again, somehow negates everything that we've achieved. You know, all the rights enshrined in doctrines of Western liberal democracy. We don't buy this, ladies and gentlemen. This is one isolated example of how progress has not completely finished, you know, its run, its continuation. So when we accept that progress is not something that ends, it has no end point, and because of this, we see that, you know, there's something that continue has to be improved on everywhere. Okay. So then essentially what we heard is that also basically there was no benefit inherent to technology just because basically that's all they said in response to everything we brought to both the benefit of technology. So we brought you this idea of diversity of ideas available to people because of things like the internet, which was a major part of the 1990s. So because of this, we see that this has inherently helped society as a whole throughout the whole idea, throughout the whole world. And basically also, the only, we heard this kind of themes like Western imperialization and how basically we screwed the rest of the world over because we wanted to promote ourselves. And the only example they brought to like substantiate this claim was the idea that some people in Africa are being exploited by pharmaceutical companies. But again, what we said is that basically this is part of the process, right? But the fact that this is now something that we're learning about, the fact that this is going to be something that, you know, those governments, as they gain more power, are going to fight. That is progress, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so now moving on into this idea of international relations. And essentially what we heard is that just because World War II and World War I were two wars that happened close to each other, have a kind of similar name, they're the exact same thing, and we learn nothing from either. Ladies and gentlemen, World War II and World War I are very different from each other. World War I happened because of nationalism, because of, you know, fighting between different kinds of ethnicities in the Balkans. World War II happened because Germany was feeling isolated and because they felt like they didn't really have a say in the international community. We don't think that these are the exact same things that we like fail to learn from our mistakes just because the two of them happened. And furthermore, we had heard this idea of the League of Nations, and it failed. Therefore, the UN will also fail. Well, we reject this logic entirely. So first of all, the League of Nations failed because America, even though it was one of the creators of it, refused to actually join it later on. So we believe that this is the fundamental reason why the League of Nations failed, and also why the United Nations will succeed, because the whole world is part of it, ladies and gentlemen. It's not like one power that refuses to be part of it because they think it'll come at some great cost to them. This is not the same thing with the United Nations. Literally every single country is in the UN. Okay, so and essentially also in response to this idea of, you know, of a better international community, essentially we just heard this week when we come up here and list a bunch of wars. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not sufficient. According to Steven Pinker, who's a Harvard psychologist, he actually analyzed, you know, war and violence and mistreatment of others throughout history, ladies and gentlemen. And what he actually came to the conclusion of is that the time we're living in right now is the most peaceful time in all history. Ladies and gentlemen, we are killing the fewest amount of people. And, you know, all these examples that we've heard of, you know, these genocides and these wars, yes, we agree that they shouldn't happen, but the reason that they sound so egregious is because we're suffering from a case of historical myopia. We're overly focused on the things that are best documented, and the things that happen most in recent memory, which was, of course, the 20th century, because we documented that very well through, like, you know, this development of technology. So because of this, we think that these are the most egregious, and we agree that these are egregious, but we don't think that this is like the most egregious thing that has happened in the past. Therefore, we think that our claim that progress has happened throughout the 21st century, it'll take a moment, is substantiated. Yes.
Are you really trying to claim that simply because one event is documented better, that its severity is lessened?
No, you misunderstand entirely what I'm trying to say. I'm saying that progress happened because less people are being killed, less people are being mistreated, and there's more of an overall consensus on human rights. This is what Steven Pinker found in his book, The History of Violence. So we do agree that it's severe and that it still shouldn't happen, but what we're saying is that if you're trying to say that progress didn't happen because of World War II, we reject that entirely, because if you look at it on a bigger scale, on the appropriate scale, ladies and gentlemen, when we're trying to measure progress on such a large level, then you would find that that progress has happened. Okay, so we heard this idea of Israel-Palestine, and somehow that justifies the idea that like there's no progress on this idea of religion. Well, ladies and gentlemen, when the majority of Israeli citizens polled are actually in favor of a two-state solution, we say something has changed. We say that something has better, and you know what, religious like discrimination is less of an issue than it used to be. Okay, so now lastly onto the idea of economics. First, we heard from the speaker before me this entirely false free trade treaties, which was brought up by Jamal, lead to more exploitation. They were designed to basically give countries equal playgrounds when they're trading with each other. This is exactly the opposite thing from what they're designed to achieve, and we don't buy this idea that essentially all the countries who have some amount of money in the developing world is because they let themselves be exploited. How can India let itself be exploited? It has come up with its own economy based on manufacturing and similarly with China. And this is based on power, not just letting another country just take all of its resources for free, essentially, and just have all the harm. Okay, so because we've proven to you on these three different levels that progress has happened in the 21st century, and that we don't need to prove to you that just because single bad things happen, progress is entirely negated, ladies and gentlemen, we firmly beg to confirm.
Scientists call the third negative.
What's unfortunate for side proposition is that they've been debating a debate that isn't the one that's occurring in this group. What they didn't listen to was the fact that their first speaker conceded the criteria that our first speaker laid out. The more accurate and the more legitimate definition, or actually a definition of progress. We told you that progress is when people learn from their mistakes, and we don't make the same issue or the same underlying principles don't allow us to harm other individuals the same thing again. The case that side proposition has brought us still up until their third speaker is listing a bunch of benefits, sticking with their initial idea of the fact that we think some benefits outweigh the harms. What we've done side opposition is beating their case on both criteria. Their criteria established by proposition and side opposition. Unfortunately, side prop hasn't met us on ours. Now, what I'm going to do for you in this 8-minute constructive speech is I'm going to break down the themes of clash in today's debate into the two main areas. That of what happened to quality of life in the 20th century, and finally what happened to global cohesion in the 20th century. So let's look at the first one, which is what happened to quality of life in the 20th century. Now, where most of side proposition hung their hat was the idea that human rights improved, and the idea that, women's suffrage happened, and that we've had improvements with women's rights. First off, we told you that this isn't always true for a lot of people. We told you that we've heard a lot of press about it. It's been a really good thing for some countries, but we don't believe that it's happened for everyone. They never told you why they think that significantly more happened, and that this justifies automatically demonizing it as some form of improvement. First off, what we'd like to tell you is that even in Western countries where they've asserted that we actually had this huge improvement, actually still is plagued by the same problems. It's still plagued by the same fundamental issues of sexism. We see that those actual issues, which were a problem in the 20th century, never got fixed. In the 20th century, we still see even now that those problems are still impacting the workforce. They're still impacting other ideas in the West. It is those ideas of sexism that we never learned to stop. We never learned to implement, and we never learned about equality, and we think because of the fact that that learning didn't take place in the 20th century, that no progress occurred. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
So now, wouldn't you agree, the fact that just because you're following essentially to the same fallacy that I accused you of in my introduction, that just because certain problems exist, you think that no progress will happen?
Right, we're not saying that we have to defend a perfect world. We never said that side proposition had to defend that. If you listen to your burdens and if you check on your sheet, what my side proposition's first speaker told you is we told you that we have to learn from what happened in the past. We think that because we haven't done that, because we still subjugate them, people still see them here, even in the West countries that you profess have been so great to women, that there actually hasn't been this improvement. Moreover, they rested their case when they actually realized that that part had been defeated by telling you that this discussion is taking place. We recognize that that is some major improvement. What we tell you is that this discussion is not happening in all countries. We tell you this isn't actually taking place in most countries around the world. They brought you just the idea of Saudi Arabia and how that happened in one country. We don't believe that their list of 21st century female leaders actually improves the fact that the majority of the 20th century, when we were subjugated, they did not actually see these benefits. Then in terms of quality of life, they told you about scientific improvements and they brought you the examples of vaccines. What we told you in our speech first on the issue of vaccines is we told you that they came up with the price of someone else. But we told you that a lot of the developments we saw in the 20th century came at the price or came at the cost of making someone else's quality of life for a period of time worse. What we tell you is we don't think that's just and we don't think that's fair. Moreover, what we tell you is that not everyone has received these improvements. They profess to you that vaccines are available to everyone because some reason charity is given to all of these people. But we ask if that's true, why do you still see people dying because they cannot access vaccines in the developing world? We see the issues of inequality in our world have still existed, and they were not solved in the 21st century, and we don't see improvement amongst them in the 21st century. Moreover, what we told you and what we heard from them is that the loss of culture didn't happen. We told you in our first speech that we think that culture is something that was severely harmed in the 20th century, that individuals' identities, more than just their language, were actually harmed. Their second speaker told you, well, the internet preserves languages, so we think that culture wasn't lost. That was not an adequate reply. And unless they give you a responsible reply as to why culture was not severely harmed in the 20th century through globalization, be it music, be it TV, be it culture, be it art, we think that all of those things were greatly lost in the 20th century. Lastly, they brought up this idea under quality of life that we have a growing middle class, and that is really great, and that's something that happened in the 20th century. But we tell you that that's not actually true. We saw a growing income disparity, but we saw that other people were getting rich and other people were getting poor, both within nations and both internationally in the global community. What we believe in on-site opposition is that the quality of life for individuals, while it may have improved in some cases, often when those improvements came, they came off the backs of other individuals, and that when they did come, they also came at the cost of other things. So let's look at this idea of global cohesion and what we heard from both sides. What we told you on-site opposition was this idea of diplomacy, and we brought you the example of the United Nations and the League of Nations, and how we saw within that time span of 100 years, we never really saw any improvement in how we approached diplomacy and how we approached international relations. We heard two things from side proposition. First thing they told you was that no, the United Nations was so much better because the US listened, and the US is actually a part of it and really comes and commits, and that's why it's so much more successful. We tell you that's simply not true. The United States, sorry to the US people in the room, still does whatever it wants. We see that with the Iraq War. We saw that they simply did not listen to international peacekeeping. We see that countries have not learned their lesson that we need to work together in order to ensure a greater good. The problem that played the first body also played the second. Their last meager defense of the United Nations was that we have peacekeepers, so that's somehow different from the League of Nations. First off, we don't think that those peacekeepers actually do a significant job. We think that there's not a lot of them. We don't think that justifies, the issues that happen today, and we don't think that was a substantial change in our point. What we were talking about here is how countries approach talking to one another, how we approach getting along and solving conflicts through an international community. We believe that has not changed, and unless they can prove to you now that it has in the POI, we've won that point.
The United Nations increases the debate amongst countries around the world because no country is absent. Every country gets a voice in the General Assembly and the individual council.
Thanks. Okay, first off, we see that was also somewhat similar to cases of the countries came together. Moreover, we don't think every country has a voice. We don't think that's necessarily true for you to assert of diplomacy in the international world today. We see that while the GNA is able to pass things, they don't actually have any power. If we look to the Security Council, we see that 5 nations who at the beginning of the century actually had power, but towards the end started to lose it, still had the same amount of power. We saw that we didn't learn and we didn't progress. Moreover, we brought you this idea of conflict, and we talked to you about how we're actually evolving and becoming more efficient about learning how to kill. They never refuted that. They never told you that development in technology that makes really, really efficient and doing really, really bad things, like nuclear weapons, was a good thing. They never justified it. In fact, they never even applied to it at all. Moreover, what we told you, or what proposition told you, is they said that trade went up because ships are faster and free trade, and that is a good thing. That was the analysis we heard. First off, okay, fine, ships are faster. We don't have to agree that no improvements happened. We believe it didn't actually improve progress. We think that because your ships are faster, that it didn't actually help development. Why has free trade actually harmed developing countries? We see that free trade in the 20th century came at a time when certain countries were at a different advantage than others. We see it came at a time when developed countries could over or out-compete developing countries. So then they couldn't develop their own national interests first, ultimately putting them at a huge disadvantage. So we think that free trade wasn't as great as side proposition tried to tell you it was. We told you about long-term issues and long-term conflicts in terms of religious conflicts. That was never touched, never dealt with, so it still stands. We told you about the environment and how we made decisions that have limited future progress, that are very hard to go back, and things that we actually haven't dealt with. We did not hear any response to the environment. We did not hear any response to religious issues. Because of the fact that side proposition has failed to engage with the debate that's actually occurring and has actually just kind of missed the case given to them, we believe that side opposition has truly taken today's debate.
Well, Right, thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to invite the reply speech from the lecturers.
What we saw in this debate was a side proposition to tell you that simply because we can list benefits that happen, we can list examples, that means that all these examples are, one, legitimate, that all these examples outweigh the numerous examples and analysis that we provided you with on side opposition. And that in fact, this is the progress that we agreed to when we agreed to side opposition's criteria. It is for that reason that in my reply speech, I'm going to be examining the two themes of human rights and international relations under the two criteria that we laid out that were accepted by side proposition. First, human rights under the first criteria, that of learning from mistakes. Anita proved this to you a lot in her reply speech. She talked a lot about how the ideas still exist, these ideas have not been furthered in many developing countries, and the fact that we haven't learned from the fact that these ideas aren't constructive means that we are not learning from our mistakes. The point that they brought to you under this is that of political achievement. We've achieved a lot politically. We've achieved a lot of equality. We've achieved a lot of really good things, and equality is really, really good. Yeah, this is what they proved. This is what they tried to prove to you on side proposition. The inside opposition provided you with numerous examples as to why this equality doesn't exist, as to why this equality was in fact impeded when we left nations behind in our development, and as to why this equality is something that they have asserted and failed to prove. And the second theme, won't limit further development. We think that we're limiting further development when we exploit the rights of others to further our own human rights. When we exploit the rights of people in developing countries to be educated on what medicine they're testing, to be educated on what we're doing to them when we're trying to further our own human rights. We think that that is the opposite of progress. The opposite of progress is when you have to step on other people in order to get more human rights for yourself. We don't think that they've addressed with this. We don't think that they've clashed with this. We think that it limits further development when we put them at such a disadvantage that they can't come back from it. Into the second theme, that of international relations. The first criteria, learning from mistakes. We've talked to you a lot about the United Nations, and these have dealt with everything that they told you about the United Nations, about why the United Nations are so good, about why they're so effective. I don't have to deal with that. If you'd like to hear about it, just look at what it is they told you. We talked about war and conflict, and about how the same justification for long-standing conflict still exists, that in fact the same long-standing conflict exists, and we see that this proves that we're not learning from the mistakes that we've made. We're not proving from the fact that this isn't constructive, that having religious disputes simply because you believe that you are right isn't something that's constructive. This is a mistake that side proposition has failed to address. We never heard them address the fact that these justifications still exist, these disputes still exist. Now, it won't limit further development. This is the biggest issue with international relations. International relations are impeded when countries don't have the same capacity to have this discussion, don't have the same capacity to have this discussion, to have this discourse, to have this decision-making power. We don't think that international relations are furthered simply because we have another global organization, we have another international organization. We don't think that this, simply because it exists, furthers international relations. That's what they tried to assert to you on side proposition, that we have the United Nations, it exists, therefore we have better international relations. We provided you with the example of the League of Nations, but how that existed. That was an organization of multiple countries. That didn't help anything. That disbanded, that failed. We had other international conflicts. We had another world war. They misunderstood the examples of the world wars. We weren't saying that they were the same. We were saying that the measures that we took to prevent them were the same. The measures that we took to prevent the world wars didn't work. We're taking the same measures now. They haven't provided you with any reason why it's going to work now. Why the same analysis that we provided to you is wrong. For the reasons that we must learn from our mistakes in order to make progress, that we must consider that history repeats itself, that we don't limit the further development of our world, that we don't limit the further development of developing countries, of countries who we've taken advantage of.
Thank you. It's now my speaker for the final speaker, the last speaker from the proposition.
gentlemen, today we have a side opposition that held their entire case on what is called a perfect solution fallacy. Essentially, side proposition didn't prove our case because we didn't prove that the world is so perfect where it is today. We had a side opposition that asserted a lot of things, but didn't actually explain to us why the principles and the human rights further in the 20th century outweigh all the lifetime examples we brought forward. We had a side proposition that misunderstood what our burden was today. Our burden today was to prove comparative benefits, how humanity is better off from where it was before the 1900s to where it is now. That was our burden today, and we proved that fundamentally in our case today. So what I would be looking at are the three main areas of touch why we think side proposition one is today. The first is international, the second is political, and the third is scientific. Now, on this first idea of international, we basically heard a side opposition that proved that the UN doesn't work because it was actually like the League of Nations, which was used to address the problems dealt with in World War I, didn't work as well. Someone told me in her speech that the League of Nations didn't work because the major players were involved. And the UN works and has continued to work because every country has a vote. We hear no positive response to this in the POI raise. In my speech, I told you the structural benefits of the UN is that everybody had a vote and that all countries had their individual interests represented. Because of this, we resolve conflict a lot further and resolve conflict a lot quicker. We essentially, again, on side of opposition, built this whole idea of how countries that were under colonialism are now at least better off when they weren't under colonialism. They essentially asserted that basically when a multinational corporation comes in and exploits a resource, is this the same as another country? Now, on side of opposite proposition, we told you that it's not the same. Because at least we have brought examples of the developing world countries who actually had economic stewardship. Countries like India, countries such as China, countries who have taken ownership over their own resources. Furthermore, these countries, as opposed to under colonialism, actually had sovereignty rights, actually had a choice about how their resources were allocated in the first place. We didn't really hear an adequate response to this. The first side opposition that took this time, but because we still have conflicts today, the 20th century wasn't in the interest of humanity. And it's that proposition that fundamentally proves to you today that because countries no longer approach international relations from such an insular perspective, and because we have a forum where we can decide issues on a more relative basis, we can move on this issue today, the international part. On the second idea, the political part. Now we have a side of the opposition that fundamentally asserted time and time again that because in Saudi Arabia, women were allowed to drive, because in Greece, there was a neo-Nazi party that was elected to only a minority position in the government, that we hadn't achieved rights in the first place at all. On that proposition totally is fundamentally wrong, because at least in countries where rights were enshrined in the Constitution, that these countries achieved rights, and at least in countries where rights were enshrined, the essential principles that these violation of rights were based on in the first place was attacked, because we have this discussion in these countries in the first place about whether the disparity in rights were justified in the first place. We think that essentially we decided properly opposition failed to give the fundamental magnitude that human rights in this debate deserve. We think that we succeeded on this point. Because we prove to you that societies have better how to organize their basically benefit in a way that gives equal treatment to every citizen. So on to the third idea, which is scientific. Now, essentially, we heard no real response to this on side of opposition. We heard only two responses. That firstly, the internet undermined culture as a whole, and second of all, vaccines aren't good because not everybody has them. And we heard a side of proposition that responds to this by saying that vaccines are more readily available, and we had a side proposition that basically told you in our first place that because we now have the means to better preserve human life as a whole, that is essentially a step towards progress of humanity. We never really heard an actual response to this. We never heard a response. Why would humanity now has a better means to address the preservation of life? Now when humanity can lower its mortality rates, it is essentially not a step towards progress. We essentially see that why communications improve progress of humanity as a whole. To summarize our proposition case, it is a case based on comparative benefits. Prove to you why after the 20th century we're better off than we were before. Why in terms of human rights, which is international relations, in terms of scientific innovations, we prove to you why the 20th century was undoubtedly the most definitive in the history of humanity in terms of progress. Thank you.
Okay, the results of this will be announced in the main hour in a few minutes. So I suggest that at this time, on this occasion, the audience on the debate and we'll discuss yeah.
And the opposition can just fill in the right.
Thank you. While she's in there, I thank you kindly.